Good evening. Welcome to Breaking Barriers. This is the first of a series of programs we're going to be doing on uh, the African American experience here in Washington, D.C. I'm Michael Nix. We're going to be interviewing a native Washingtonian, Sgt Davis. Carrington, how about if we start with some questions about you and your background? Native Washingtonian, Howard grad.
Yeah, I was born in Washington and went to Spingarn High School, went to Howard University, and I'm I'm here.
Okay. Officer in the Vietnam War, African American officer during the Vietnam War. Part of your experience there, is there part of that you'd like to share with us?
Well, yes, I was in the Vietnam War, and I was a lieutenant, and I went to Howard. And while I was at Howard, the war arose. It was very interesting, and a few things happened, and I got drafted. So I decided to join because I wanted to be near my girlfriend. And I knew if I joined, I could choose where I wanted to be, so I chose to be in Army Intelligence. And I was stationed at Fort Holabird, Maryland, which was nice. And from there, I decided that I wanted to go to Officers Candidate School because if I was going to be in the military, I didn't want to be an enlisted man because being an enlisted man is a very dangerous thing to be in the middle of a war. So I went to Officers Candidate School.
Okay.
And I spent time in Vietnam. I was an engineering officer with the 14th Combat Engineers. If I'm moving ahead, let me know. But I went to Officers Candidate School and chose engineering and went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia to be close to my girlfriend, which I'm glad I did because it gave me an engineering experience. I'm in essence a civil engineer. Military engineering is something that comes out of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Building bridges and things like that, roads, is basically civil engineering. So that's what I did, and I spent time in Vietnam, and it was a very interesting experience, if I may say.
How long were you in Vietnam?
I was in Vietnam for a year.
Okay.
From August the 8th, 1967 to August the 8th, 1968. And the historic part of my tour in Vietnam is the fact that I was there doing the Tet Offensive, which was late January of 1968. And then Martin Luther King was killed on April the 4th, 1968. And then in June, Bobby Kennedy was killed while I was in Vietnam. Of course, I left in August '68 and came back to the Democratic Convention and all this kind of stuff. But
Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Yeah. But I can remember there was one of my troops. I was an officer, a lieutenant. And when Bobby Kennedy got killed, there was a white guy from North Carolina who was one of my men, and he came to the tent. Everybody was white for the most part, except me and a few of my men. He heard Bobby Kennedy had gotten killed, and he said that he was happy about that. And I threw him out of my tent. But I understood that he saw it that way. I do recall too, the same soldier, that he said that he was getting ready to go back to the States. This tour had ended, and he was going to go back and be trained as a helicopter machine gunner to come back to Vietnam, which I thought was insanity. But also his pants were raggedy. He'd gotten to the point that we did a lot of work, and he had torn fatigues. And I can't tell you how hard it was to get new uniforms for people over there. Vietnam, at this taping, I just saw a program last night, not this program, I went to the movies to see the movie called The Post about the Pentagon Papers. And about all the lies that were told during the Vietnam War. I recently have been watching Vietnam on PBS, and I've been getting angrier and angrier every time I watch it because when I was there, we didn't know about all the politics and all the subterfuge that resulted in all these problems with the war, with the strategic decisions, and the fact that a lot of the men had 16 rifles, which were toys. I was fortunate. I had an M14, 9 pounds, 5 ounces, heavy round. It was like an AK-47. You could stick it in the mud and keep shooting. So at this point, I'm sort of reflecting on the war and my experience in the war, and my experience as a black officer, and my understanding of the history of how officers, the opportunities for blacks to be officers, and the troubles blacks had going to West Point. And I'm also familiar with the article in the Atlantic magazine in 1986, which spoke to the rise of the black officers class, and how that although the civil rights movement may not, by 1986, have done many things throughout the society for the black people, that in the military there was basically equality, success, and other things that were not happening as fast as in civilian life. But it's always been that way in the military, because when people start shooting at you, you have a tendency to forget all the differences you may have with other people.
That's a very good point. Also, 1986, about the time of the rise of General Powell to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and at that time I was working for Les Aspin, a congressman from Wisconsin, and I remember Les telling us about he'd met this general, African-American general by the name of Colin Powell, and Les was thinking, my gosh, this guy's not only should be a member of the Joint Chiefs, he should be chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And this was happening in the late 1980s.
Right. I think in our conversation you mentioned that you knew Congressman Dellums, how he had taken over
who was a subcommittee chairman at that time, and,
right.
and Les and Congressman Dellums came into Congress at the same time in 1970. Going back to something you just mentioned there, you mentioned that you were there while you were in Vietnam when Senator Kennedy was shot as a presidential candidate. You were also there when Dr. King was shot in Memphis. You had one of your troops. I'm looking on that as kind of a racially tinged reaction to Senator Kennedy being shot. Any similar events that took place in the aftermath of Dr. King's shooting?
Well, that's interesting, because I was hurt. I was in the 6th Convalescent Center at Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. I had been at Cam Ranh Bay. At that time, I was a place called Tui Wa.
Okay.
And I got hurt because I was with these other officers. We were in this tent. We were upgrading QL1, the main road in Vietnam. And we were in the tent that night. We were watching Hollywood Parade. I do remember that. And we were drinking liquor. And I had to use the men's room, so I went outside. And in Vietnam, in any war, you have what you call light discipline, because at night people can see a match from great distances. So I covered the tent back up to make sure it was dark, and I walked. And I got to a certain point, and I said, why am I walking all the way to the latrine? This is the middle of nowhere.
Right.
So I decided to stop there and urinate. And while I was urinating, my mind said, why are you going to urinate in one spot? It's unsanitary. So what did I do? I took a step to my right. As I took a step to my right, I felt my right leg sinking into the ground, and I didn't know what was going on. I reached out, and I tried to grab myself with my left leg, and as I hit the bottom of this pit, I wrenched my knee, pulled my ACL, or metatarsal ligament, and I screamed. I was hurt. And so a few seconds later, there was a flashlight pointing at me, and it was Sergeant Kim and Lieutenant Latrakis, a Baltimore guy. And Lieutenant Latrakis said, what are you doing swimming this time of night? It was about 2 or 3 inches of water in this pit, which the first sergeant had dug because he wanted to create a new latrine, as opposed to the latrine that we had was all the way over another side near the wire.
Okay.
Okay, then we going to the bathroom at night near the wire.
All right.
So I got hurt, and without the long story, this captain I had decided it was time to deal with me. He was not a good guy. The other captains I had were, and the colonels I had were. I think it was a little racial. This is my opinion. But he transferred me to another unit. I was going to the 14th Combat Engineers as opposed to this construction unit I was in. And so when I was sent down to transfer, I went down to Cameron Bay to change planes to go up to the DMZ, the Company C, the 14th Combat, up in Contienne. So my knee was still hurting, so I walked into this medical facility at the Air Force Base. As soon as I walked in the door, a captain, an Air Force captain, doctor that I used to drink with said, "What are you doing here? What's wrong with your knee?" So I said, well, I told him the story. He said, "Come on in my office." He got in his office, he looked at it, he said, "You torn something." He wrapped me up, put me in a truck, and I was at the 6th Convalescent Center on the beach at Cameron Bay for 6 weeks.
Okay, including April of 1968.
I was there in April of 1968
Okay.
when King got killed. And I can remember white guys coming up to me and saying, "I'm awfully sorry to hear about what happened."
That's good to
A
hear.
lot of that happened. I can also recall that while we were in the 6th Convalescent Center, since we're talking about the racial aspects of this, the Officers Club. Went to the Officers Club one night, and we were raunchy. We were,
As officers'
clubs,
tend to
right.
be, right?
So this doctor, Lieutenant Colonel, came in. He walked in and said, "You all raunchy. We can hear you all the way back up the hill." He said, "You got to stop it. I'm closing this place down." And some people looked at him because, unless you're a full bird colonel, if you're not in a combat artillery, infantry, armor, signal, and engineers, then when the shooting starts, you don't have anything to say.
Got it.
But he was a doctor in the hospital, so he closed the bar down. We're walking back up to the barracks, and a couple of white guys, because everybody was white except me and a few other people, were getting into some problems.
What percentage would you say? 90%?
Well, yeah.
And
Officers were all white except it was me and about three other guys.
10% of the officers, Hispanic, Latin Americans, many.
There was a Puerto Rican guy in Officers Candidate School with me, and other than that, I think there was a Japanese lieutenant that I worked with.
So one Asian American, one Hispanic American.
Right.
Okay.
That's a whole other story. The Japanese guy, he was a very nice guy, very nice guy, real tough. Didn't talk to anybody. But when it was time to go home, he became very friendly. But anyway, these two guys got into a problem, and one of them was bigger than the other. And the black officer came up to one of the other officers and said, "Look here, leave him alone. Don't mess with him." He said,
Him being you.
No, him being this other white officer that somebody was threatening. He said, "He's from Alabama, I'm from Alabama, we don't mess with him." I said, anyway.
Specifically you mentioned the comment about Senator Kennedy's assassination.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any similar comments in the aftermath of Dr. King's assassination?
Oh, no. That was Dr. King's assassination when I was in Council Convention. And Kennedy, when Kennedy...
But I mean, did anyone approach you with any type of, were there any comments made about, our condolences or with you?
Well, like I say, the 2 or 3 guys came to me and said, white guys, and said that they wouldn't let me know that they were upset about that too.
Got it.
When Bobby Kennedy got shot, that was in June, and I can't think of the gentleman's name, that one of my troops that came in. He's walking the tent, and they found that Kennedy got shot. He was a nice guy too. I mean, he was a nice guy, but he didn't like Bobby Kennedy, I guess, for whatever reasons. And he made that comment. My sergeant was a white guy, and 6'4", Clint Eastwood looking type of guy. And that's another story. Since we're talking about race a little bit, we had some new recruits come in, and this was when I was with the 14th Combat, and we were up north, and we had some replacements, and the sergeant said, we got some new guys coming in, I'm gonna go out and straighten them out, and then you can come out later, I'll call you out later. I said, okay. So he went outside, I was reaming these people out, I said, you are in Vietnam now, blah, 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 and they said, you better. So he said, you need to get ready to meet the lieutenant. So he called me, Lieutenant Davis, meet these new recruits, not recruits, but replacements.
Right.
I walked out, I had my green t-shirt on and my fatigues, no shirt, no rank. And I walked out and I looked up, there was 3 white guys and a brother on the other end of the line. And they were standing there at attention, and he just dropped his arms and looked at me as if he didn't know what to do. So I didn't even, deal with it. I just, oh, you guys in Vietnam, being a nice cop,
Right.
But he couldn't handle it. He didn't know what to expect. He saw me.
Might have been the first African American officer he'd ever encountered.
I probably, because he was very, very taken aback by that. Which reminds me, another incident with the same sergeant. He was a good guy, 6'4", like I said, he's a Clint Eastwood type dude. And we had the men all lined up. We're in Vietnam, and we're getting ready to leave where we were. It's called Utah Beach, Wonder Beach. And we're going to go out to LZ Nancy, which we cut. I like to say I cut it because I was the officer in charge. It was for the 5th Mech Infantry coming out of Fort Carson. And so the men were lined up, and the sergeant said, when we get out to this part, this is not the base camp. We get out here, I don't want y'all running. There's a lot of mines and booby traps out there. He said, I don't want any of y'all running around like a bunch of wild Indians. So one of the guys in the unit raised his hand and said, excuse me, Sergeant. He said, do you mind if I run around like a wild Indian?
Because he was Native American.
He was Native American,
There
right.
you go. There you go.
Later that evening, when I got back to my tent after wherever I was, I heard some discussions in the tent. I walked in, and this guy was standing over my sergeant while he was lying in bed, complaining. And I said, oh, we can't have this, So I calmed him down, took him out, and of course, being Native American, he was able to relate to me, and I was able to calm him down. I had another interesting situation when I was at Cam Ranh Bay, before I left Cam Ranh Bay, because when I went to Vietnam, I went to Cam Ranh Bay with a unit that ran the rock quarry. It was the largest rock quarry outside of Australia and Southeast Asia. I was a shift officer, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. I was a lieutenant. And we were crushing rock and making things happen out there. And this white guy, enlisted man, one of my troops, he was having a lot of trouble. He was from Chicago, a red-headed guy because he's Irish. And he was in the Army business as opposed to going to jail. So the captain did something, and put him in some jeopardy. So I took him out to go talk to him and cool him down. And we had a very nice conversation, about a half an hour. He was cool, everything was cool. The next day, the captain did something that just made no sense at all, and just destroyed that whole, messing with this cat, which really made me angry because there was no reason for it. This is the same captain who transferred me to the 14th Combat.
Okay, another questionable incident on his behalf.
It was questionable, but he was the kind of guy that would come and tell you about his exploits when he was in Tokyo on R&R, married, officer, all that kind of stuff. And he was not a real good captain. I can't think of his name, but if he's watching, everybody knows it. But then there was Colonel MacDonald. He was a good one. He was the 14th Combat. No, that was Blackjack MacDonald was with the 577. No, getting confused. Anyway, there's good officers, bad officers. War is interesting in terms of the kind of people you meet.
Okay. And you left the military when?
I went to Officers Candidate School and came out June of 1967, and got out of the Army in August 25th of 1969.
So Richard Nixon is now president of the United States.
Richard Nixon was president. Before I got out, I was under his command when I was at Fort Meade, Maryland, after I'd returned from Vietnam. And then I went back to Howard. So when I came back from Vietnam, I went to Fort Meade, Maryland. And we went up to Fort Dix and built a Vietnam training camp, huts, booby traps, everything, so you can go get trained, just like it's in Vietnam.
Still using your civil engineering training while in the military there, but back here in the States with these projects.
Right. They wanted, in those days, they were building Vietnam villages on Army bases so that you would have training would be realistic. Okay. In terms of the construction and the layout of a village, so when you went to a village, you know, you knew what to expect or what it looked like.
Some major political events took place while you were in the military. You mentioned Dr. King's assassination, Senator Kennedy's assassination, Richard Nixon being elected. First Republican in 8 years since Eisenhower. Eisenhower being a decorated war hero, the Allied Supreme Commander in Europe during World War II. President with Nixon as his vice president. Subsequent writings have laid open the fact that Eisenhower wasn't really crazy about Nixon. Reaction of you and your fellow officers to Nixon being elected November 1968?
Well, we didn't talk politics because officers don't talk politics.
Okay.
Because that's the commander-in-chief. I don't care who the commander-in-chief is.
Okay.
I don't care what you think about him. That's called good order and discipline. But I can remember when we were at Fort Dix. It was 1968, which will add to one of the things that you're talking about. The Olympics. We were me and all the officers were just out playing football, tag football, and we got some beer and some pizza. We were sitting in the barracks watching the Olympics. And then all of a sudden, in
Tommy
the middle of the
Smith,
Olympics,
John Carlos.
Exactly. And all of a sudden, it was quiet. I mean, everybody was quiet.
Yep.
Now, when that ended, the national anthem stopped playing, we went back to drinking beer and eating pizza.
No comments were made?
No comments.
Okay.
No, right. I've had conversations from a racial standpoint with other officers coming along. I can picture them. I don't know their names. And we talk about race and racial stuff because even to this day, my experience is unique. I'm giving myself an understanding of that. I was born in Washington, D.C. I was raised in a middle-class neighborhood. When I grew up, the police would drive through our neighborhoods to a less economically developed neighborhood. Right. I'm lucky. I know that. But we'd have conversations, and in many cases, people had never met another black person before, and the first one they meet is me, and I'm just a different kind of cat. But they would tell me their experiences, and there was one other situation I think might be interesting. Before I went to Vietnam, I was stationed at Fort Irwin, California, and outside of Los Angeles, it's halfway between Las Vegas and L.A., 20 miles from Death Valley. Might as well have been in Death Valley, but 20 miles from Death Valley. It's a desert training center for tanks and all that kind of stuff. And I can recall that while I was there, I met a lot of people who were interesting in a lot of ways. What was that story? Doggone it, it slipped right out of my mind. When I was at Fort Irwin, the reason I was telling you this, that's what it was. The company that when I went out of Officers Candidate School, I went to Fort Irwin, and when I got there, everybody said, bye, you're responsible for packing up all our equipment to do this rock crushing stuff in Vietnam. So, I did that, and while we were in the process of pulling these pieces together, one of the fellow officers that I was working with made it. It was an interesting situation that occurred. The captain who was in charge of the unit was leaving the Army. He was going to go to Vietnam and then fly back home because he's retiring. But his replacement was a lieutenant, first lieutenant. I was second lieutenant. They didn't like him, but I mean, he's a white guy. The sergeants didn't like him because he wasn't a captain. Okay, but he and I, before we left to go to Vietnam, we went into Los Angeles. I said, "Come on, let me take you to L.A. show you around." So because he's Eastern Michigan, he grew up in an environment where his father wasn't real happy with black people. But we went into town, and I called my cousins. My aunt's cousin's a dentist, and they had young kids. One of them, Hamilton Cloud, is his son, who was produced Shogun for NBC and produced the NBC Awards every year. So they weren't in; they were on vacation. I found out because I called some friends of theirs, and the friends said, "Well, you know, they're on vacation." I said, "Well, we'll get a hotel." I said, "No, come stay with us." We went and stayed with them. He stayed with us, and we went out, partied. We had a great time. It was a great experience. I think for him, he had never expected the kind of experience that African Americans had that he had. Even the girl we were staying with said that, she said, "Look, we're going out tonight." She said, "I don't know any white girls," said, "but I know a black girl that likes white guys." She was accepted to Berkeley that year. So anyway, he was a good guy. When we got to Vietnam, they politically got him out. Mm-hmm. And when he got out, they sent this captain in as the one I told you that Eric was a real difficult person, and eventually he sent me to the 14th Combat, which was the best thing I think to happen to me, because when I left the 14th Combat, the night I left, I woke up one morning and said, "Okay, it's time for me to go." So my replacement was there, who, by the way, got wounded. And I packed my bags, and went to the office. The first sergeant, I said, "I'm leaving. I'm going back to the base camp because I'm due 2 days to go down and get out of the country." He said, "Well, you can't leave till the captain comes back." I said, "I'm leaving." All my men came in, even white guys that looked at me strange, came in and shook my hand and said, "I'm glad to have served under you."
You had to have been changed by your experience in the military between the earlier days at Howard and then your...
My friends, like Arnold Montgomery, would tell you I was a different person when I came back. But you know something? I was a better person. I knew who I was.
Okay.
I had some experience about life.
And thank you again for being with us. Breaking Barriers. This is the first of a series of events we're going to be doing. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you very much.